He thought he could bury her with a single accusation, ruin her name, and walk away untouched. But the moment Emma Lawson stepped into his courtroom, something shifted that he could never control. Before we go any further, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you believe respect should never be judged by appearance, make sure to like and follow, because stories like this remind us what real justice looks like. Now back to Emma Lawson. The courtroom of Franklin Pierce was known for its silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that pressed against your chest, heavy with authority, polished mahogany reflecting the overhead lights, rows of spectators sitting stiffly, as if even breathing too loudly might draw attention. And at the center of it all sat Judge Pierce himself, tailored suit, silver hair perfectly in place, eyes sharp with the confidence of a man who had never truly been challenged, especially not by someone like her. Emma Lawson walked in quietly, her soft gray cardigan slightly wrinkled, her hair pulled back simply, no designer labels, no air of power, just a woman who looked like she belonged in a classroom, not a courtroom. And that was exactly why Pierce had chosen her, because to him she looked easy, disposable, someone he could make an example of without consequence. The whispering started immediately, subtle but cutting, people glancing at her, some with pity, others with quiet judgment, and Pierce noticed every bit of it, a faint smirk forming as he adjusted the papers in front of him, because this was the moment he had planned, the moment he would remind everyone in that room who held the power. Emma stood there, alone at the defendant's table, no high-profile attorney beside her, no flashy defense team, just a folder in her hands and a calm expression that didn't quite match the tension in the air, and that calmness, though no one realized it yet, was the first crack in Pierce's certainty. He leaned forward slightly, voice measured, almost bored, as if this case were already decided, as if she had already lost, laying out the accusation with precision, each word designed to corner her, to make her appear small, careless, guilty in the eyes of everyone watching. And for a brief moment, it seemed to work, because the room grew even quieter, the kind of silence that signals judgment before a verdict is ever spoken. But Emma didn't react the way he expected. No panic, no trembling voice, no desperate interruption. Instead, she simply listened, her eyes steady, absorbing every word, every detail, every inconsistency hidden beneath his confidence. And somewhere between his final sentence and the echo of it fading into the courtroom walls, something imperceptible changed, something subtle but undeniable, because while everyone else saw a simple woman being cornered, Emma Lawson was already beginning to see the mistake he had made, and the room, though it didn't know it yet, was about to witness something it had never seen before. Judge Pierce allowed the silence to stretch just a moment longer, savoring it, believing it belonged to him, believing that every pair of eyes in that courtroom had already accepted his version of events. And when he finally spoke again, his tone carried that same quiet authority that had built his reputation over decades, each word deliberate, controlled, almost rehearsed, as he outlined the sequence of events that supposedly placed Emma Lawson in clear violation of the law, his fingers lightly tapping the polished wood as if punctuating his certainty. And around the room heads began to nod, subtle movements, but enough to suggest that the narrative was settling into place exactly as he intended. Emma stood still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her posture neither defensive nor submissive, just steady. And that steadiness began to draw a different kind of attention, the kind that does not come from noise but from the absence of it, because while others shifted in their seats or exchanged glances, she remained completely composed, her gaze fixed not on the spectators but on the judge himself, as if she were measuring something far deeper than the accusation being presented. Pierce noticed it, though he did not fully understand it, a brief flicker of irritation crossing his expression before he quickly masked it, continuing his explanation with greater emphasis, leaning into the details, reinforcing the timeline, tightening the narrative, because in his mind complexity meant control, and control meant victory. But Emma's eyes moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, following his words, tracing the sequence, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for most to catch, but enough to signal that she had found something, a thread that did not align. a detail that did not sit correctly within the structure he had so carefully built. A murmur passed quietly through the back rows as a clerk shifted papers, the soft rustle echoing more loudly than it should have in the heavy stillness. And Pierce took that moment as confirmation. Assuming the room was leaning further in his favor, his voice growing just a fraction stronger, more assertive, as he concluded his statement and prepared to move forward, already anticipating the next step, already expecting compliance. Then Emma moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm precision that immediately redirected the energy in the room, her hand lifting slightly from the table as she opened her folder, the sound of paper sliding against paper cutting cleanly through the silence. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear and steady, reaching every corner of the courtroom without effort. And in that single moment, before the words themselves even registered, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the balance of the room had tilted just enough to be felt. Pierce paused, just briefly, the smallest interruption in his rhythm, and though he recovered quickly, something had already changed, because for the first time since she had entered, Emma Lawson was no longer standing there as someone being judged. She was beginning to stand there as someone who understood exactly what she was looking at, and the room, though still silent, no longer felt certain about who was truly in control. Emma did not rush her words. She let the silence breathe for just a fraction longer, long enough for every eye in the room to settle on her, long enough for Judge Pierce to realize that whatever came next would not follow the script he had written in his mind. And when she finally spoke, her tone was calm, almost gentle, but carried a precision that immediately felt different from anything heard so far. She asked a single question, simple on the surface, directed at the timeline he had just presented, and for a moment it seemed almost insignificant, something easily dismissed, but the way she held his gaze made it impossible to ignore. Pierce responded quickly, almost too quickly, repeating the detail with confidence, reinforcing it as fact, his voice steady, but there was a subtle tightening in his expression, the kind that only appears when certainty begins to feel just slightly less secure. And Emma nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she had just confirmed something she already suspected. She lowered her eyes briefly to the documents in front of her, her fingers moving with quiet familiarity as she flipped to a specific page, the soft sound of paper cutting through the room again. And then she spoke once more, this time not with a question, but with a clarification, pointing out a discrepancy so small that most would have missed it, a timestamp that did not align, a sequence that could not logically coexist with the version presented. And as the words settled, a ripple moved through the courtroom, subtle at first, a shift in posture, a few exchanged glances, the kind of reaction that signals doubt beginning to take root. Pierce leaned forward, attempting to regain control, dismissing the detail as irrelevant, framing it as a misunderstanding. But his voice no longer carried the same effortless authority. There was an edge now, a slight strain beneath the surface, and Emma did not challenge him directly. She did something far more unsettling. She agreed, softly, almost respectfully, and then added another detail, another piece that connected to the first, building not an argument, but a pattern. And with each addition the room grew quieter, not the earlier silence of passive observation, but a sharper, more focused stillness, the kind that comes when people begin to realize they are witnessing something important. A clerk shifted in her seat, a spectator leaned forward, and somewhere in the back a pen stopped moving mid-note, because what had started as a straightforward proceeding was no longer straightforward, and Emma, still standing in that same simple cardigan, still speaking without raising her voice, was beginning to reshape the entire narrative without ever appearing confrontational. Pierce's fingers pressed more firmly against the bench, his composure still intact but no longer unshakable, and for the first time since the hearing began, he hesitated before responding, just a fraction of a second, but enough to be noticed, enough to break the rhythm he had controlled so carefully. Emma closed her folder slowly, her eyes lifting to meet his again, steady and unwavering, and in that moment it became clear, though no one said it out loud, that she was no longer reacting to his case. She was guiding it, and the courtroom, held in that tightening silence, was beginning to understand that the foundation beneath his authority was not as solid as it had seemed only minutes before. The air in the courtroom had changed completely now, no longer heavy with assumed authority, but sharpened with uncertainty. And Judge Pierce could feel it even if he refused to acknowledge it, his posture still rigid, his voice attempting to reclaim control as he leaned forward and addressed Emma with a tone that carried a hint of impatience, reminding her that minor inconsistencies did not invalidate the larger case, that the court dealt in substance, not trivial details, but the words did not land the same way they had before, not after what she had already revealed. Emma listened without interruption, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were allowing him the space to continue. And when he finished, she gave a slight nod, not in agreement but in recognition, and then she spoke again, her voice steady, measured, each word placed with deliberate care. She acknowledged his point about substance, and then quietly redirected the focus, pointing out that substance is built on sequence, and sequence must hold together under scrutiny. And as she said it, she reached once more into her folder, drawing out a document that had not yet been mentioned, holding it lightly as if it were nothing more than routine. Yet the way she placed it on the table made several people in the room lean forward without realizing it. She did not rush, she did not dramatize. She simply asked permission to reference the document, and the request itself, so composed and precise, made it difficult to deny. Pierce hesitated, just briefly, before granting it, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and Emma began to walk through the contents, not as an argument, but as a clarification, aligning times, connecting records, and with each connection the earlier narrative began to strain, small fractures appearing where everything had once seemed seamless. A spectator in the front row shifted, her expression changing from passive interest to focused attention. A court officer glanced down at his own notes, as if verifying what he thought he heard, and the quiet murmurs that had once supported Pierce now faded into a deeper silence, one that carried weight rather than assumption. Pierce attempted to interject, to steer the direction back to familiar ground, but Emma did not challenge him directly. She paused, acknowledged his point, and then returned to the sequence, layering detail upon detail until the pattern became undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, undeniable in its quiet logic. The rhythm of the room had changed, no longer driven by authority but by attention. Every word she spoke drawing the room further away from the version that had been presented at the beginning, and closer to something far more uncomfortable, something that suggested the structure itself might be flawed. Pierce's fingers pressed harder against the bench now, the controlled calm he had maintained beginning to show strain at the edges, and when he spoke again there was a slight hesitation, a pause that did not exist before, and that pause echoed louder than any objection could have, because in a room built on certainty, hesitation is its own kind of revelation. Emma lifted her eyes once more, meeting his gaze without hostility, without defiance, just clarity. And in that moment it became unmistakable that she was no longer simply responding to what had been brought against her. She was dismantling it piece by piece, not through force, but through understanding, and the courtroom, wrapped in that tightening silence, was beginning to realize that the power it had assumed belonged to one man might have just shifted entirely without anyone noticing when it happened. By now the courtroom was no longer simply watching. It was listening, every movement quieter, every breath more deliberate, as if no one wanted to miss what would come next, and Judge Pierce could feel that shift pressing against him, the weight of attention no longer reinforcing his authority but questioning it. And for a brief moment he adjusted his posture, straightening slightly, attempting to reclaim the space with a firm tone as he addressed the court, emphasizing procedure, reminding everyone that interpretation without proper context could be misleading, his voice steady but no longer effortless, as if each word now required more intention than before. Emma did not interrupt. She allowed him to speak fully, her hands resting calmly against the table, her expression composed, but her eyes never leaving him. And when he finished, she responded with the same quiet clarity that had begun to reshape the room, not opposing him directly, but refining the focus once more, explaining that context is only meaningful when it remains consistent across all records. And then she gently introduced another piece, something that had not been mentioned at all, something that connected not just to the timeline, but to the origin of the claim itself. A subtle stir moved through the room as she referenced it. The kind of reaction that comes when something unexpected enters a conversation that once seemed controlled, and even the clerk at the side of the room paused, her pen hovering just above the page. Emma stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, but with quiet confidence, aligning the new detail with the earlier inconsistencies, showing how the sequence did not just contain minor errors, but relied on a foundation that could not logically exist as presented. And the more she spoke, the more the narrative began to loosen. Threads that once appeared tightly woven now separating under scrutiny. Judge Pierce attempted to redirect again, his voice firmer now, pressing back with emphasis, suggesting that the argument was speculative, that it lacked authority, but the words did not settle the room the way they once would have, because Emma did not react emotionally. She did not raise her voice or challenge his tone. She simply returned to the structure, pointing out that the authority of a claim is measured by its consistency, not by who presents it. And as she said it, a quiet stillness fell again, deeper than before, because the implication did not need to be stated out loud for everyone to understand it. A man in the second row leaned forward, his brows furrowed. Another spectator slowly shook her head, as if something no longer made sense. And even one of the officers standing near the wall shifted his stance, his attention now fixed entirely on Emma rather than the bench. Pierce's composure held, but only just. The confidence that once filled his presence now edged with something tighter, something less certain. And when he responded this time, there was a pause, small but unmistakable, before his words came, and that pause echoed through the room more loudly than anything else, because in a place built on precision, hesitation reveals what certainty tries to hide. Emma closed the final page of her folder with a soft, controlled motion, her gaze lifting once more, steady and unwavering, and in that moment it became undeniable that what had begun as a case against her had transformed into something entirely different, something far more dangerous for the man who believed he controlled it, because the structure he had relied on was no longer holding, and the room, wrapped in a silence that now felt almost electric, was beginning to understand that the truth was not emerging in bursts, but in careful, undeniable steps that were leading somewhere he could no longer predict. The silence no longer belonged to the judge. It belonged to the truth that was slowly unfolding in front of everyone, and Emma Lawson could feel it settling into the room, steady and undeniable, as she lifted her gaze once more, not with defiance, but with clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly where the path leads. Judge Pierce shifted in his seat, a movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed earlier. But now every motion carried weight, every adjustment felt amplified, and when he spoke again his voice was still controlled, but something beneath it had changed, a faint tension, a carefulness that had not been there before, as if he were now choosing his words rather than commanding them. Emma did not press him. She did something far more precise. She stepped back just enough to let the structure of her argument stand on its own, allowing the connections she had already laid out to breathe in the silence. And then she introduced one final element. Not dramatically, not as a reveal, but as a continuation, a record that traced the origin of the filing itself, the point where the case had begun, and as she described it, her voice remained even, measured, almost gentle, yet every word landed with increasing weight. The timeline tightened, the inconsistencies aligned, and what had once appeared as isolated discrepancies now formed a clear pattern, one that pointed not to confusion, but to construction. And as that realization settled, a visible shift moved through the courtroom. Shoulders straightened, eyes widened slightly, and somewhere in the back a quiet breath was drawn and held. Pierce responded, but this time there was no immediate authority in his tone, only a controlled attempt to reframe, to suggest procedural interpretation, to emphasize complexity. But the words felt thinner now, less grounded, because Emma did not engage them directly. She simply returned to the pattern, calmly restating the sequence, allowing the logic to stand without embellishment, and that restraint made it impossible to dismiss. A clerk slowly lowered her pen, her notes unfinished, as if writing had become secondary to understanding, and one of the spectators leaned back slightly, the expression on his face no longer neutral but unsettled, as if he had just realized that what he thought he understood at the beginning was no longer intact. Emma closed her folder again, this time with finality, the soft sound echoing more clearly than before, and she remained still for a moment, her hands resting lightly, her posture composed, and then she spoke one more time, not to argue, not to accuse, but to clarify, summarizing the sequence with quiet precision, drawing the line from beginning to end in a way that required no interpretation, only recognition. The room did not react immediately, no one moved, no one spoke, because the weight of what had been presented needed no reaction. It simply settled, undeniable, and in that stillness Judge Pierce sat facing not a challenge, but a reflection of his own narrative unraveling, piece by piece, under the simplest standard of all, consistency. His eyes moved briefly across the documents, then back to Emma, and for the first time there was no trace of dismissal, only the unmistakable awareness that control had shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely, and the courtroom, held in that deep, unbroken silence, understood that whatever happened next would no longer follow the path he had intended. For a long moment no one spoke. Not even the quiet rustle of paper dared to interrupt what had settled over the courtroom, because the realization had already begun to take hold, slow but certain, and Judge Pierce knew it, even before anyone else dared to acknowledge it out loud. He adjusted his posture again, but this time the movement was not one of control, it was one of recalibration, as if he were searching for ground that no longer felt as stable beneath him. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a new tone, still formal, still measured, but stripped of the effortless dominance that had defined it earlier, replaced now with something more cautious, more deliberate, as though every word needed to be carefully placed to avoid making the situation worse. Emma Lawson did not move immediately. She allowed that shift to exist, to be felt, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, and then she took a single step forward, not to confront, but to clarify, her voice calm as she addressed the final piece of the sequence, not adding new information, but connecting everything that had already been revealed into one continuous line, one that could not be broken without collapsing entirely. She spoke of sequence, of origin, of consistency, not as abstract ideas, but as the very structure that determines truth within the courtroom. And as she spoke, the connections she had built earlier tightened into something complete, something undeniable, and the effect was immediate, though no one reacted outwardly, because the weight of it did not require reaction. It required recognition. A man in the front row slowly exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. The clerk's pen remained still on the page, and even the officers along the wall stood more rigid, their attention fixed, not on the bench, but on the quiet figure standing at the table. Pierce attempted once more to respond, but this time the pause before his words stretched longer, just enough for everyone to notice, just enough for the absence of certainty to become visible. And when he finally spoke, the authority in his voice felt thinner, as if it no longer carried the same weight it once did, because authority, when separated from consistency, begins to sound like something else entirely. Emma did not interrupt him. She listened, as she had from the beginning, and when he finished, she simply nodded, acknowledging his words without challenging them directly. And then she delivered one final statement, not forceful, not accusatory, but precise, summarizing the sequence in a way that left no room for reinterpretation, her tone steady, her gaze unwavering. And in that moment the courtroom understood something that no one had expected to witness when the proceedings began, that the person who had appeared to hold all the power had lost control of the narrative completely. The silence that followed was deeper than anything before, not uncertain, not tense, but absolute, the kind of silence that comes when the outcome is no longer in question. And as Judge Pierce sat there, facing the structure he could no longer defend, the room did not need a verdict to understand what had just happened, because the truth had already spoken, and it had done so without raising its voice. No one moved. No one even dared to shift in their seat, because the moment had already crossed a line that could not be undone, and Judge Pierce knew it before anyone else said a word, his eyes lowering briefly to the documents in front of him, as if searching for something that was no longer there, something that had slipped away piece by piece while he believed he was still in control. The courtroom remained still, the kind of stillness that carries weight, not confusion but realization. And When Pierce finally spoke, the sound of his voice did not command the room the way it had before. It entered the silence carefully, almost cautiously, as if aware that it could no longer dominate it. He attempted to restore order, referencing procedure, suggesting a need for further review. But even as he spoke, the words felt like they were reaching for structure rather than defining it, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Emma Lawson stood quietly, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, and she did not interrupt him. She did not press the advantage. She simply allowed the moment to unfold, because the truth she had laid out no longer needed reinforcement. It stood on its own, clear and complete. A faint sound broke the silence as someone in the back shifted, the small movement echoing louder than expected, drawing attention to the fact that everyone was now fully present, fully aware. No longer passive observers, but witnesses to something far more significant than a routine proceeding. Pierce paused again, longer this time, his hand resting on the edge of the bench, his fingers no longer tapping but still, and when he looked up, there was a change in his expression, subtle but undeniable, the absence of certainty replaced by something quieter, something closer to recognition. Emma met his gaze without hostility, without triumph, just steady understanding. And that made the moment even heavier, because there was no confrontation to resist, no emotion to deflect, only clarity that could not be ignored. The clerk slowly set her pen down, not because she had finished writing, but because there was nothing left to record that had not already been understood, and one of the officers along the wall straightened slightly, his attention no longer divided, his focus fixed entirely on the exchange at the front of the room. Pierce cleared his throat, a small sound that carried more weight than any formal declaration, and for the first time since the proceedings began, he did not speak immediately after, the pause stretching, filling the space where authority once stood without question, and in that pause, the room felt something shift completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. Emma did not move. She did not speak, because she did not need to. The structure she had revealed had already done what it needed to do, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was resolved, the kind of silence that comes after something has been fully seen for what it is. Pierce's eyes moved once more across the room, taking in the faces that no longer reflected assumption, and in that moment it became unmistakable that whatever decision came next would not restore what had been lost, because control, once revealed to be flawed, cannot be reclaimed by words alone, and the courtroom, held in that deep and final stillness, understood that the balance had already shifted beyond return. The silence did not break with a loud declaration or a dramatic conclusion. It settled into something far more powerful, a quiet understanding that moved through the courtroom like a slow, steady current. And Judge Pierce sat there for a moment longer than expected, his gaze no longer fixed with authority, but lowered slightly, as if weighing something that could not be undone. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the sharp certainty from before. It was measured, restrained, almost careful, as he acknowledged the need for further review, the need to reassess the foundation of the case. And though the words were procedural, their meaning was unmistakable, because in that room everyone understood what had just happened without it needing to be announced. Emma Lawson did not react outwardly. She did not show relief or triumph. She simply stood there, composed as she had been from the beginning, her hands resting lightly, her eyes steady, as if this outcome had never been about winning, but about something deeper, something that had already been achieved the moment the truth became clear. A quiet shift moved through the spectators, not applause, not even whispers, but a subtle change in posture, in expression, as people began to look at her differently, no longer as the quiet woman who had walked in unnoticed, but as someone who had revealed something essential, not just about the case, but about the system itself. The clerk slowly gathered her papers, her movements careful, almost respectful, and one of the officers near the wall straightened fully, his gaze following Emma, as if acknowledging her presence in a way that had not existed before. Pierce remained seated, his hands now still against the bench, and for a brief moment he looked up again, meeting Emma's eyes, and there was no hostility there. No attempt to reassert control, only a quiet recognition. the kind that comes when a person realizes that authority without integrity cannot hold under scrutiny. Emma gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as a gesture of victory, but as acknowledgement, and then she turned, her steps calm, unhurried, moving toward the exit with the same quiet presence she had carried into the room, yet everything around her had changed. As she walked, the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor, each step clear in the stillness, and no one spoke, no one interrupted, because the moment did not call for words, it called for understanding. The doors opened, light from the hallway stretching across the floor, and as Emma stepped through, she did not look back. She did not need to, because what had been left behind was no longer the same as when she entered. Inside that courtroom, the silence lingered a moment longer, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of what had been revealed, and in that stillness, the room seemed to remember something it had nearly forgotten, that justice does not belong to power, it belongs to truth, and when truth stands quietly but firmly, even the highest authority must eventually yield.